almost completely within the postmodern terrain, so to speak. We have talked about the ancient theories, later on theories of modernity, etc. And we have seen now a certain perspective actually having been developing. I'm not sure if it's a correct word to express this, but evolving or whatever, okay, persisting throughout all this journey. Now, however, with the culmination or bringing into the picture, coming into the picture, that set of theories, at least in our field, in other fields it may assume different forms, but structuralism turned out to be quite influential and, so to speak, if you like, destructive for the modern theory, for the modern perspectives, okay? Especially in its so-called post-structuralist forms, starting with Lacan, Althusser, and others, and so on, okay? And the project almost completely turned into a kind of project of destruction of this subject or decentering of the subject. A subject which was quite important for us simply because our knowledge claims, all our meaningfulness of our knowledge claims had been dependent upon our status as the subject of knowledge and history and so on. We are the human beings, you know. We are the most precious and most important things in existence. The existence revolves around us, so that it was us who give and distribute meaning to the things. Okay, now this picture beginning to shudder down. Okay, no longer we are at the center of the universe, and no longer meaning can be conceived as something dependent upon us. Okay, meaning acquires a kind of autonomy, so to speak. And all the discussions in connection with the signs, signifiers calling for or producing other signifiers, etc., have been pointing on this direction. Even the naive conceptualization of a structure, say in early structuralism, had been dispersed. Dispersion actually refers to that famous Kantian unity of the concepts. Well, this unity of the concept in that framework was based upon one practical requirement, so to speak. That was unity of apperception. Apperception means, so to speak, sort of the self-perception of the perceiving body of itself, okay? Whatever it is, not necessarily us, our awareness, for instance, okay? So it necessarily assumes a form of unity simply because it needs to keep itself as if it is a meaningful whole, okay? So all meaning originates from this supposition of unity. What unity disappears? Later on, the unity remains, as Baudrillard would call today here, waning or fading away vestige of the past. Okay, vestige of the past, the term vestige, some trace, some slight fading away trace of an object or something which is no longer here. Okay. Or a waning memory of something which is no longer here. Okay. Therefore, as you can understand today, we are going to talk about Baudrillard, his contributions, his, so to speak, radicalism, radical postmodern stand. It appears that he was the most avant-garde, so to speak, of all postmodern thinkers who, without any hesitation, actually identified himself openly and clearly, declaring that he was a postmodernist, a postmodern, beyond being a postmodernist, a postmodern. And we will see why and how this happens, okay? Okay, in contradistinction to earlier thinkers, some were of the origin of from historical disciplines, some the overwhelming majority of whom were philosophers, etc. Baudrillard was true and true sociologist. Okay. And actually, a sociologist who started writing in the, so to speak, mid-60s, let me say so, mid-60s or towards the end of the 60s, mostly within the Marxist tradition. You know, all these Frenchmen, as I said, those years, the intellectual scenery being dominated by the leftist intellectuals. And of course, it was not a surprise that they've been all influenced by Karl Marx, Freud, and some other, Nietzsche, including other important figures, okay? But throughout his intellectual journey, we will see that Baudrillard diverts from Marxism and passing through kind of semiology, which I would not directly call structuralist or post-structuralist, but having connections with them, and later on becomes the true and true postmodern thinker. Okay. Okay, his first book, published in 1968, okay, entitled The System of Objects. Okay. Well, actually, in these early books, you can, if you take a look at them, you'll find that there are lots of things, observations, discussions, which were quite useful for a sociologist interested in studying the contemporary society. Okay, for instance, take this book. What was its title? The System of Objects. Okay, actually, here in that book, Baudrillard primarily making a reference to the so-called consumer society. Actually, that concept he develops here, and it becomes the title of his second book, later book, okay, Consumer Society, where objects proliferate, okay, and constitute a certain system of objects, about which he later in his second book will talk much more, okay. So he is interested in that first book with the mass consumption processes taking place in our contemporary societies. You know, we even talk about our being the consumer society and so on. So everybody engaged in this consumption economy, and the consumption economy gives way to the proliferation of the objects. Or rather, what in this study Baudrillard observes actually, it is not only a quantitative change. And what brings to the foreground the consumption society or the phenomenon of mass consumption is not simply a quantitative change, referring that an individual living in our society began to consume more. Okay. No, what he observes in that work is primarily that this mass consumption, this phenomenon of mass consumption, brings about a qualitative change in our relationships with the objects. Okay. Our relationship with the objects began to change. A theme which he later emphasizes in his later book, published 2 years later in 1970, entitled The Consumer Society. Okay. Now, in this book, however, he makes an interesting turn, he takes an interesting turn and begins to claim that the system of objects which are themselves organized into a consumer society. You know, that is an interesting observation, simply because in our usual ordinary thinking of a consumption society, for instance, our real actors are already the individual consumers, okay? Yeah, the individuals, you and I, okay? Going out there, buying something and consuming it, relating ourselves with a certain piece of art, etc., and consuming it, watching films, consuming them, etc., etc. Okay, but here, in that second book, there is a very serious shift, an emphasis that, implying that, saying that, okay, it is the objects now beginning to constitute a system, okay, a definite system. Actually, here, he begins to establish a sort of parallelism first, okay, between the objects and system of science, okay, system of objects on the one hand and the system of science. You know, in the structuralist theories, you know, the system of science has been auto-produced, if you like, okay. It is the product of the society, well, all right, but no individual or no social group, whatever, since they are not the owners of this system, okay, would be able to manipulate the components of the system as to rearrange it, for instance, okay? So the idea that objects began to constitute a system in consumerist society turns out to be a quite radical observation in relation to our commonsensical thinking of the consumption, process of consumption. You know, ultimately we come to believe that consumption is according or up to us, according to our own tastes or preferences or whatever, okay? Now, however, Baudrillard's claim was that the objects themselves, having been distributed in space in relation to certain set of systematizations among themselves, and not depend, that systematization being not dependent upon our individual preferences any longer, okay? Actually, you can, if you take a closer look at the second book, you can find out that Baudrillard gradually beginning to, we shouldn't say this for this moment. What he was trying to do in these two early works, actually to bring semiotics closer to Marxism, or to inject kind of semiotics, semiology, or structuralism, if you like, into Marxism, okay? Linguistic structuralism into Marxism. But the third book, which was quite famous and very influential in its own time, published in 1972. Now, we have left behind 1960s and entered into 1972, which was quite a revolutionary decade, actually, in terms of theory, social theory, okay? That book was titled For a Critique of the Political Economy of the Sign. Okay. As the title already indicates, it displays heavy influence of Marxist thinking. Actually, it mimics Marx's own title, okay, Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy. Now, the political economy, however, turned out to be the political economy of the sign in that work, and this gives us, even though Baudrillard still is mimicking the major tenets of Marxist thinking, okay, he began to distance himself from Marxism with that work, actually. That was a very controversial book in its own time, as I said. Okay. But what will interest us more is his later works. I call these two later works, I think, can be interpreted as works of departure from Marxism as well as modern thinking within the history of Baudrillard's intellectual transformation, okay? In 1973, there comes the Mirror of Production, where he openly begins to criticize Marx, and in 1976, the book with the title Symbolic Exchange, and that shows the sunlight, okay? Now, I want to read perhaps some quotations and then continue to interpret this. In this Mirror of Production, before quotation, maybe a little bit introduction would be in order. In this mirror of production, what Baudrillard's primary point of critique against Marxist theory is concentrates on the theory of value. You know, according to Marx himself, value assumes two basic forms. One is found in primitive societies in the form of use value. And with the rise of the capitalist society, a new form of value had been introduced into the picture, okay, exchange value. And these two are categorically different from these two, simply because in capitalist societies, under the capitalist social organization of production, okay, exchange value replaces use value, and use value can no longer be visible, okay, under the coverage of the exchange value. So all the products now have been valued according to their exchange value rather than use value. Okay, that turns out to be the part of the critique of the alienation, okay, human alienation. So, however, Baudrillard claims that, and I guess he was right in that. Of course, we need to take a closer look at the conceptualization of use value in Marx's own text, but I'm convinced on my part that, okay, for Marx, even though there are some texts or some expressions in Marx's writing who defy that interpretation, I can roughly say that for Marx there is a certain conceptualization of human nature. Okay, whatever it is not everywhere clear, it has not everywhere been stated, so on and so forth. Okay, but the basic conviction is that there is such a belief in the existence of human nature. So use value actually, and I'm convinced in that, use value can only be connected with this, and when only it is connected with this human nature, it acquires a specific meaning actually. Okay. Otherwise, within the framework of a theory, for instance, where there are no naturally given needs and wants, okay, all the needs, and where all the needs and wants are produced by the social organization, okay, there is no meaning of using the term use value, okay, simply because use value turns out to be the function of the social organization of production, okay, referring to nothing essential, in other words, okay. So it would not be categorically different in that sense from the concept of exchange value, okay. At that point, Baudrillard directs his critique against Marx, okay, so that claiming that actually use value is nothing else than an alibi of the exchange value, okay, and it has been produced by the exchange value simply because the needs and wants which were seen as indispensable for human nature are all socially produced, okay. In that regard, let me, if I can find, okay. Okay, the argument is something like that. I'm reading from Douglas Kellner's text. In all societies prior to modern society, exchange is conducted through a series of symbolic transactions. Okay, this is Baudrillard's position. So that in primitive societies, he would claim that what we are going to find is not use value, but simply symbolic exchange, okay, devoid of any notion of value, okay. Symbolic transactions not yet coded as value. Value emerges only with capitalism, which distinguishes between use value and exchange value, and it is system of political economy. This system constitutes a fundamental rupture with the complex systems of symbolic exchange and inaugurates an exchange of goods according to the laws of the market, governed by quantitative measures of exchange. Political economy thus replaces the concreteness of symbolic exchange with the abstractions of exchange value, in which money and market economy constitute a new realm of value. Okay, so that okay, we are still Marxian, and therefore we are making categorical distinctions between capitalist and pre-capitalist, in parentheses perhaps primitive societies. Now, Baudrillard's argument was that in these pre-capitalist societies there was no notion of value. Okay, yeah, okay, let's shrink it a little bit down. Let's say primitive societies. Okay. Later on, simply because he would change this classification into something like this. Okay, he would call this metallurgical society. Based upon a concern with production. Well, this is the symbolic society. Okay. So here what's at stake in this primitive society is rather symbolic exchange. The individuals changing things with each other. Okay. We have talked about it a little bit earlier as far as I remember, in connection with Marcel Mauss's famous work, The Gift, okay, generous exchange. So the items themselves having no value actually. The only value that item can carry, actually cannot carry, only transmit, okay? That's given by one individual to another individual, or by one group to another group, okay? So if there is no such giving and taking, the item itself here does not have any value. You can just throw it away.
But weren't superiority and inferiority between the gifts? If I give
yeah. This is due to the act of giving and taking, not due to the item that is given or taken. Okay, the item itself has no importance at all. For instance, I give you all the oranges in my garden. Okay, say 2 tons of orange. I give them to you. What would I do if I don't give them to you? Nothing. They would simply hang on the tree and corrode. Okay, that's all. I give them to you, and therefore creating a relationship of credit and debt. Okay. So the item itself does not have any value. The orange itself, for instance, has any value as long as I satisfy my hunger. Okay. So the remaining orange has no value at all. Okay, I freely can give them to you, to any other one. Okay, so giving and taking, establishing the social relationship. In that sense, this is truly a symbolic exchange. The items having no value for their own selves, in their own selves. Okay, Baudrillard draws our attention to this fact. Okay, it's a gift-giving economy. Within the system of gift-giving economy, the gifts are given not because, even today, you know, among ourselves, the gifts are given and taken not because the items given and taken consist of any value at all, okay, but rather it is the sign of a social bond, that's all, okay. So that's what creates that inequality between the giver and the taker, okay. Therefore, emphasizing this, okay, so that differentiating pre-capitalist or primitive societies as the symbolic exchange societies, which is predominated by symbolic exchange, and telling us, as the quotation says, okay, it was only in the capitalist society value had been generated, and primarily generated in the form of exchange value, and later as an appendix or annex to the exchange value, the concept of use value had been produced as well. Okay, for what, Baudrillard would argue, to function as an alibi, as a disguise, okay, for the validity of the exchange value. There was a very good passage for this, but I'm not sure I will be able to find it. So another point of interest was that this symbolic exchange actually was something concrete. By this concreteness, we simply imply that it has been done in face-to-face relationships, and it has been realized through the transference of some tangible item, okay, from one to the other. Okay. However, here, within capitalism, the relations of exchange turn out to be quite abstract. Okay? Exchange value is something quite abstract. And despite the first appearance you may thought of about the concept of use value, it turns out to be quite abstract as well. Since, for instance, if I do not connect it to natural human needs, you know, three basic, they say, okay? What were they? Procreation, having children, offspring, okay? Nourishment, and shelter. Okay? If you do not connect the notion of use value to this, but rather try to understand it within the framework of those produced needs, you'll find out that it does not have any difference from the exchange value at all. Okay? Simply because, yeah, for instance, today, let's talk. We were talking about procreation, nourishment, shelter. Is there anybody among you who would say that cell phones cannot be considered as part of our need? Computers, for instance. Are they need or what? Extravaganza of our consuming habits. What are they? Is there anybody here in this class who doesn't carry a cell phone? Or having a computer in his or her desk? Nobody. Huh? What do you think? Are they need? Or having them is a need or what? An extravaganza of our consumption. We are living in a consumer society. We tend to consume everything, okay? Consumption means taking hold of something on the one hand, and tangling with it for a while, and later departing from it, okay? Throwing it away, okay? So, what do you say? Cell phone. Yani cebime bakıyorum var mı diye de göstereceğim de.
It depends on its function. If my cell phone meets my needs, that can, yani bilgisayarla yapabileceğim her şeyi karşılıyorsa, so I don't need a computer and I want one.
Now the problem that I want to arrive with my question was this. Do we really think that we can live without a cell phone in our contemporary society?
No.
Do we really think that we can live without a computer in our contemporary society? That's the problem. It means that they are needs. If you like, they are vital needs. We cannot live as a proper member of the society without having them. That's the problem, okay? That's the point Baudrillard tries to make in here. Okay, so were they the needs of the primitive man, for instance? Of course not. What a primitive man is going to do with a cell phone? Okay, so it is not relevant for his life and his existence. But this little tiny example is enough to show us that what we call needs are socially produced things. Okay. Not being themselves over there undetachably attached to our human existence. Okay? Simply because what we call our human existence underwent enormous transformations throughout the history. Okay? And nothing which has been past remains here, there at its place. Okay? And continuously being replaced by other things. And they have being the products of the society, not our own makings. Okay? So, for instance, we may or may not, personally I speak, may not like to have may or may not like to have cell phone in our pockets. But it turns out to be a necessity.